In London, this is The Economist. I'm Ryan Avent, the economics correspondent, and joining me in our London studio is Thomas Piketty, author of Capital in the 21st Century, a hit blockbuster book about the rise of wealth and income inequality across the rich and the emerging world. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for inviting me.
One of the trends you identified is related to income inequality, which before the kind of the First World War was at a very high level across most of the rich world, then fell very significantly, and then again in the past few decades has risen most of all in the United States, but also to some extent in other rich countries. Is that right?
Yeah, so there are really two processes going on. One is about the rise of the inequality of labor income, and another possible evolution for the future is the rise in inequality of property, inequality of wealth. So if we start with the rise of labor income inequality, particularly in the United States over the past few decades, I think this has partly to do with the changing supply and demand of skills with globalization and, probably too unequal access to education and skills in the US. Now, that's probably not going to be enough to explain the rise of, the top 1% of 0.1%, because it's not as if the education of this group is a lot higher than the next 1 or 2%. So here, to explain this part of the story, which is only one part of the story, but it's an important one quantitatively, according to our findings with Emmanuel Saez. Probably you have to look deeper as to how top managerial compensation is being set, and I think our textbook economics model, is saying that when you are paid more, it must be that your marginal productivity, your marginal contribution to the output of your company is higher, and this is probably a good model for most of the distribution of wages. Now, is it a good model at the very top? When you manage to get a pay increase from $1 million to 10 million or from 10 to 50, does this necessarily mean that your marginal product has gone up that much? I think it would be a very naive view of how the labor market operates.
So we have the story about labor income. Are we seeing a rise in the concentration of wealth in the hands of a relatively small share of the population?
In the United States, I think we do. In Europe, it's more limited, and the main phenomenon, the main evolution so far has been an increase in the total quantity of wealth relative to income. But in terms of concentration, it's either stable or rising slightly. Now, the fact is that even though it has not, even though we are not back to the extreme level of wealth inequality that we had prior to World War I, we are still at a level of inequality of wealth that's much higher than the inequality of labor earning.
Wealth and capital are becoming more important in the economy, and the book explains some of the dynamics that are generating this shift. So why is wealth becoming more important, both relative to income and in terms of the overall distribution of resources?
So it's really the combination of several forces. The first explanation for the return of what I call a patrimonial society or high wealth to income ratio is largely a long run recovery process. In the 50s, 60s, the total quantity of household net wealth relative to GDP was only 2 to 3 years of GDP, as opposed to 6 to 7 years of GDP on the eve of World War I. And this is largely because wealth destruction during World War I, World War II, very limited investment. A big part of private saving, for instance, in Britain, was absorbed by public debt to pay for the war, and then this was destroyed by inflation in the post-war period. Also, you had some policies like nationalization, rent controls that reduced the market value of real estate property in the 50s and 60s, and then you have a long recovery, and so part of what we're seeing of this long-run recovery of the wealth-to-income ratio just comes from this very sort of natural process. And let me be very clear that there is nothing bad per se about that. We should not be nostalgic of the 50s and 60s where, all the wealth had been destroyed and very little had been invested for so long. The other part of the story is also the decline of population growth. We had in this baby boom cohort period, population growth was adding a lot to productivity growth in order to produce high GDP growth rate. And we should not forget that half of historical growth in GDP comes from population. Now, this seems to be over, at least in European countries, in Japan, and this is part of the reason why we see in those countries, more than in the United States, a rise in the wealth-to-income ratio.
How important is different savings behavior among different sort of demographic groups to this story? So as I think about the dynamic of an aging population and contributing to slowing growth rates, it also suggests to me that we're going to have people who are running down their savings as they retire, and so that if they're running down their savings, wealth and capital wouldn't be as likely to accumulate. Is that right, or should we expect something different?
Well, it's again, nobody knows what future saving behavior will be like. Empirical evidence suggests that there are many different reasons why people save, and there doesn't seem to be any obvious reason why the saving rate, as we get richer and richer, will actually go down. They could remain the same, they could be higher, they could be smaller. But we should not believe that simply because of aging, at some point people will just draw on their assets.
Right.
This can be counteracted by many other forces.
One of the main policy recommendations in the book is a global tax on wealth, that may be attractive for some reasons, but politically it seems like it might be a difficult step to take for a lot of countries. Are there other things that could work at a national level that governments ought to focus on if they're concerned about income concentration, wealth concentration?
Right. So, first of all, the main policy to reduce inequality is education, investment in skills. So, you want a broad-based educational system that allow, large segment of the population and not just a small elite to access education. So, right now, the average income of Harvard parents of Harvard students is equivalent to the average income of the top 2% of the US distribution of income, which is, I think, a bit too much, because you want to have a, meritocratic system with broader access to top schools. No country has invented the right system yet. Now, education is important, but sometimes, we also need progressive taxation of income, and also progressive taxation of wealth. Now, that doesn't need to involve a global government with a global tax. This is not an all or nothing approach. I believe in step-by-step progress. So, look, in Britain, you have a debate right now about mansion tax, and in fact, as far as I know, there is a 5% tax rate on transaction above £1 million that was created by a Labour government, and then the Conservative government created a 7% tax rate on mansions above £2 million. So there seems to be a debate that goes beyond left and right. So, sometimes you have strange things happening politically because the economic fundamentals make the taxation of wealth attractive when you have very, very high wealth levels relative to labor income. Now, of course, you can do more, especially for large financial portfolios, if you have more international cooperation. And this is true for the taxations of multinational corporate profits. Right now, our small and medium-sized businesses are paying higher effective tax rates than large multinational corporations, which is not good in terms of equity, but that's not good in terms of growth either. Now, is it easy to counteract this trend? No. Is it impossible? No. I think 5 years ago, everybody would have said that bank secrecy in Switzerland will be with us forever. And then, the US government came with sanctions on Swiss banks, and Switzerland and then Luxembourg and other European countries have agreed to enter into automatic exchange of information. So if you put the right sanctions and you analyze the cost and benefits of financial opacity for the different countries and put sanctions that are in line with the benefits that some people or some countries are getting out of opacity, then you can make progress. So, I am much more optimistic than what a number of people seem to believe after they've read my book, and so I feel sad, if my book has made people pessimistic, and, I think there are reasons to be reasonably optimistic.
Well, Thomas Piketty, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
The Economist.